Not a single person I've ever talked to says, oh, I wanted to go and do this. Nobody wanted to go and do those things.
They didn't want to do them. It was not in their nature to do them. I was fully convinced that we were God's chosen people. Our father was the leader of a Mormon religious.
Our dad had 13 wives.
He was more revered than Jesus.
Hello, everyone. It's Katie from Without a Crystal Ball. Today, I have some amazing guests on my channel. I have Celia and Anna LeBaron. So that's their maiden names. They are from the new series on Hulu, Daughters of the Cult, and they bravely shared their story of being the daughters, the survivors of Ervil LeBaron, and their series has been a huge hit. Like, everyone's watching it, everybody's talking about it. So welcome, ladies.
Thank you, Katie. It's a joy to be here. We enjoy talking about our past and our lives, and we always want to do it in a way that brings more goodness into the world. And so that's why we do these interviews.
Wonderful.
That's what we want.
Wonderful. So we'll dive into your series, but I'd love for the audience to know a little bit about who you are. So do you want to share a little bit about yourself, Anna, and then Celia?
Sure. Okay. So like who I am today, I am a mother of 5 grown children, and I have one 4-year-old granddaughter. So I'm a grandma, but my grandma name is Yaya, which is Greek for grandmother.
I love that.
Yeah. So I'm in a really good place in my life right now. And I'm currently in grad school earning a master's degree in Christian spiritual formation and leadership. And I graduate in May. So I'm very excited and happy and have lots of good things happening in my life that I'm just tickled about, that I get to share these things after, we're going to talk about our early lives, just how incredibly difficult they were. And so being able to share with your audience that no matter what your family of origin story is, you can overcome odds, even if they're stacked high against you, and create a life that you're proud of.
I love that. I love that. And are you married or are you single?
I was married. I'm not anymore. I'm divorced.
Okay.
So I would like to be married once again at some point, but
we'll just put that out into the universe for you.
Listen, it would need to be somebody that has the same kind of spiritual values as I do. So I think I'm looking for a needle in the haystack.
You mean, wait, not a polygamist?
No.
All right. Celia, tell us about yourself.
So I'm Celia LeBaron. I was also born into the fundamentalist Mormon cult compound that Anna was born into. And we're survivors of that type of upbringing. And we have gone on to make good lives for ourselves after escaping from that. Anna escaped when she was just 13 and wrote to tell about it in her book, The Polygamous Daughter. And she asked me if she could use my real name just because we're very close. And I've been, I was a big part of the book. And she was afraid I would say no, because I used to be so private about this. And I did not want anyone to know that Ervil LeBaron was my father, because of all the harm that he caused so many families and generations. And I just decided it was time. My children, I'm also divorced. I was married for 17 years to my children's father. I have 3 grown children, and they're very supportive. And so I'm free now to talk about it and say everything. I am.
What I loved about this series, Celia, was seeing you, because you were in her book. So I have 2 books. One is the book by Anna, and the other book is The Witness War Read by Rebecca Musser. And the reason why your book and her book are so, I think I recommend so much, is it's 2 women that were sort of put into impossible situations and had very close connections to these people that were doing really bad things, but yet you were able to like escape from that and become sort of like a whistleblower of it and really sort of shape the way people view. I think, Anna, your book really helped a lot of women and men see that the people that were underneath your father really weren't.
That was one of the main things that I was trying to accomplish with the writing of my book. If you look online, there's there's a whole stack of books written about my father, Ervil LeBaron,
Yes.
and the cult. So there's a stack of books this high. I have to go back to, get it high enough, that are written by the adults, by investigators, by journalists, by women who were polygamous wives as adults. There was not a book written from the perspective of a child born and raised in it.
Yes.
And so
you're accurate on that.
I wanted, and none of Ervil's children, for sure. So maybe other people in other polygamous sects had written, but I'm not aware of. Like, I wouldn't know to that. But from Ervil's children, none had been written from our perspective. And I felt like that was what was missing from this conversation. What was it like for the children? And so one of the things that I wanted to do with my book when I wrote it was put blinders on and not tell anyone else's story. And so I've been criticized a lot in the reviews of my book, and I don't mind this criticism at all, because it's an accurate assessment, because people say she didn't talk about any. She didn't name names and say who did what to who, when, why, and where. And that was not the purpose of my book.
But that's not, and that's also not your story.
Right. And again, I didn't want what I tried to do was, if I didn't know it, my reader didn't know it.
Right.
Because I wanted them to experience life through my lens. What was I feeling? What was I thinking? What was happening on the inside of me when things were swirling around me? And sometimes, and I was very judicious about this, sometimes I would say what I didn't know then to give the reader context about what was happening, but I used that very, very rarely, because I wanted the readers to experience life growing up with me. And when I found out things, that's when my reader finds out. And so, like, I didn't know that I was in a cult.
Right.
Even when I walked away, I didn't know I was part of a cult.
Right.
I didn't know about any of them until I was in my mid to later teens, and I found that book in Lillian's house, The Prophet of Blood. And when I read that one secretly under my covers,
yes,
that's when I found out everything. Like,
something about your book that I absolutely loved is that there isn't a lot of voices for the children that grow up in this culture. There's a lot of voices of the old ex-sister wives, but there's really not a lot of people speaking about what's happening to these kids. And I feel like that is so easily glossed over by the media, because they just assume that the picturesque, beautiful sister wives are, of course, taking care of their children and everything is beautiful and fine. But what I loved about your book specifically was how I felt like I was going with you in the dumpsters when you were dumpster diving, and how I felt like I was in the warehouse with you cleaning your appliances. Or one part that really I remember being so heartbreaking for me is remembering you sleeping and being so scared when you were brought, I think it was to Mexico, and you had none of your family there, and you had bugs and everything like crawling all over you. And you were so close to Celia. And at this point, I believe, weren't you were separated. And it was heartbreaking, because I knew that you probably just wanted someone there.
Someone familiar.
Yeah.
She was living, I think maybe Hiram was living with you at that time, but he's like your baby brother. Other than that, you had no family. She would sometimes come to where I was, and I remember just being so happy to see her, but not allowed to complain when she had to leave again. She would just come for visits usually, and then she would.
When Anna was in Mexico, where were you?
I was also in Mexico. Just at the time, she was living with, should we say their real names?
I mean, in the book, I changed their names because I wanted to protect their daughter's privacy. But in the documentary, it said, so I changed a lot of people's names in the book, especially my family that have suffered a lot. I didn't want to be the cause of them, being noticed, or dots, people connecting the dots. And here's my real hope. with the documentary, people were named, and my real hope is that if anyone connects the dots between people that they learn about in the documentary or in an interview or something that we do, if anyone connects those dots to a real life person that they know in real life, that they will say, let's go have coffee, and pull them closer and say, tell me more.
Or just respect their privacy.
If they want that, respect their privacy. And if you're doing business with somebody that's doing good work for you, give them more business.
Right.
That's my hope and my prayer, that my family will just receive goodness, because you can't have this conversation without talking about how many lives were affected.
Devastated.
And so we can't have this discussion about this documentary and our history without acknowledging first the victims, the atrocities that were committed by people who were following my father's orders. There's so many families that were affected and harmed incredibly, and we acknowledge that. And that should not be, those people should not be overshadowed by the gruesome things that happened that we have to talk about, because they're real.
Because there's victims on both sides. Like, all my father's children were victims.
100%. If the documentary does nothing, it really humanizes all of you kids. And so it was wonderful. What I loved about the documentary is in the first couple, throughout the documentary, there's these clips of all of you sitting around a table, and you're conversing about your experiences, and each one of you had such different memories.
Well, we were separated so much. But I also don't want to just continue on this conversation without saying that Celia and I understand the gravity of the harm that was caused, and the people's lives that were affected. And it was affected by people that we love and care about, because they're our family. And this has to be a very nuanced conversation where all of these things are held in tension.
Right.
And I feel like in having these conversations, and I carry the weight of the responsibility of speaking of these things, hopefully in ways that will bring good, healing to everyone, and healing to people. And we're willing to have the hard conversations about this.
It's really interesting that you were to bring that up, because I was speaking to one of Owen Allred's granddaughters yesterday. And I let her know that you guys were going to be on the channel. And, she had such positive feelings about both of you.
Oh,
what?
That matters so much to us. Oh my goodness.
Oh,
that's really what we want. We want them to understand we weren't just little monsters.
No, and she doesn't she recognizes that what happened to her great uncle was horrible, and it really it created just sort of this ripple effect within their group.
Yes, absolutely.
And that means so
generational trauma.
Right now.
Well, and it's not even just the generational trauma, it's that Rulin and Owen were a little bit more open, and they didn't want to be as oppressive. And unfortunately, when that happened, over time, it's just become more and more and more strict. And a product of that is likely that fear that you're going to lose someone again,
Yeah.
But yeah,
I think so. I would have to say that's probably true. What our dad did impacted them for to today, even moving towards today, and it was all negative. It was all just super, super negative, and made them probably a more closed culture, which is not healthy.
No.
Yeah.
Because as the two of you are aware, when it's insular like that and there's no outside voices, that's where the echo chamber can begin.
Yeah.
But
that's what we were raised in.
Yeah. And she was just so grateful that you all were speaking and sharing your stories. And doesn't hold anything against the children. Like, she feels like if you were to hold things against you, then she could have things held against her for what her grandfather did.
Yeah.
We don't want to be responsible for what our parents did.
Right. And
We did not choose our families.
She didn't choose her grandfather to steal millions of dollars from an actress named Virginia Hill, you know. She doesn't want to.
So at the same time that we can so appreciate her perspective, and the kindness and nuance with which she's, you know, viewing us, we understand that not everybody is there yet, or wants to be there yet.
Yeah.
And their feelings have to be acknowledged as valid, and what's good and right for them at this time. And you know, not everybody will get to the place that we want them to come to, if it's possible. But we're hoping that by just sharing our voices and lending our voices to this, that we can help dispel some of the fear that might still be residual with that. And then also ask for forgiveness in advance if we, you know, while I said, you know, we have to hold this intention, if we maybe lean a little bit this way or a little bit too much that way, that everyone involved can be kind in giving us a little bit of leeway, because this is such a difficult, complex conversation.
And we have to acknowledge that what happened to them and their family was absolutely wrong on every level.
There's no undoing the harm, but if possible, can we maybe create some good here now? How many, you know, 3 decades? It's been over 3 decades since the LeBaron cult has disintegrated.
Well, I can see, you know, what I would love to do is put you guys in touch with her.
Well,
if you ever want to speak to her, I know she would. I mean,
it would be an honor to speak to her, honestly.
She is the most loving, sweetest woman ever. She's been through so much. Her dad was on the priesthood council. It's, you know, there's just been a lot. And so, yeah, she was so excited to find out that you guys were coming on the channel. So
if good can come from it, we're willing to do it.
And and frankly, of most of the women that I work with that are the apostates of the AUB, they mostly like deeply admire the two of you.
Oh, that means a lot. Thank you for sharing that. It's hard to publicly speak, because there are those people, those haters that come out and say, you know, that we're probably still dangerous and frown upon us, or just don't like our speaking style. And so you put yourself out there when you talk publicly for criticism, and it's really hard to take that, but you have to go into this knowing that that is going to happen.
You know, I can take the criticism because I'm not a perfect person, and I will make some missteps along the way in trying to do good. But I feel like the good that can happen and that's possible is let's lean into that. And let's, you know, criticize anybody who's saying anything and trying to do good.
You're almost, I mean, a lot of you that leave, one of the biggest challenges I've witnessed in the women that I work with is the dialogue that comes from these groups, where they are called wicked and evil, and their experiences are gaslit. Like, that didn't happen to you. You're a liar. That's not true. Have you experienced anything like that? Whether from, your father's group has dissolved, but from other people that are maybe still in this world of polygamy, where you feel like your what happened to you isn't validated?
Well, here's you know, one of the mentors that I have, his name is Bob Hamp. He's been very, very helpful to me in processing through the history. And then he encouraged me to write my book. And, you know, I would talk to him at times, and, you know, one day I ran into him unexpectedly, and he, you know, we were talking, and he said, "When are you going to write your book?" You know, just playfully, but encouraging. And I said, "Well, I'm very worried about what other people are going to say who have different perspectives than mine." And he stood there, like, let's just pretend like you and I are talking and it's him. And he held up, like, I'm him now. So he held up his hand to me and he said, "Do you see fingernails?" And
And the answer is, of
I'm
course,
looking
no.
at the palm of his hand and I said, no, I don't see any fingernails. And he goes, what's wrong with you? I see fingernails.
Mhm.
And in that moment, it was like, oh, two people can be in the same room experiencing the same event and come away with two entirely different experiences.
Anna, Anna, you and I have that same experience.
Yes.
We were taken to Mexico and
Mhm.
left with people in Mexico, other followers of our organization, and we were separated. Anna was 9 and I was 12. And I thought I was just like, I knew we would end up back with our mom. I didn't feel abandoned. I thought, oh my gosh, this is so crazy how we're living here and they don't have a refrigerator and they don't have any hot water. And it was like super impoverished conditions in Mexico. We had concrete floors, which are popular now, but back in the day, they were just raw concrete floors. And then there Anna was 9 years old. She felt like she was never going to see her mother again. She felt completely abandoned. She was
Yeah.
suffering terribly. I'm just like, wow, what is going on here? This is crazy. When I get back to Colorado, wait till I tell people, that's how just totally different experiences,
And
even
I
though
think
we
it had to
were
do with your age and
for
my
sure
age.
the age. Yeah.
Mhm.
But yeah, completely different feelings about what was going on in our lives at the
Yeah.
time.
And so if you have people who have left any kind of religious situation like this and people that are staying in, everyone's motivated by different things about how they view and perceive and experience the different events that are happening. And so to tell someone you're lying,
Mhm.
that your motivations are, horrible or evil, or you're trying to do harm, it's that's kind of a stretch to get in, like to assume that you're inside the mind of someone else and understand those things. And so I feel like there's a need for people to be kind and to assume the best unless you have evidence that's different.
That's just a great way to live your life, I think.
There's that quote, when people show you who they are, believe them the first time,
Mhm.
And so if someone has been awful to you and wicked to you or evil to you, then absolutely have the boundaries and have the, wherewithal and the self-worth and value to, make the right choices about how much connection you'll have with them. But unless that's the case, let's be kind and compassionate for everyone's lived experiences, because you don't know somebody's lived experiences. Like until Celia and I were grown adults talking about our experiences, we didn't know half of it.
Mhm.
And we were, not together all the time because we got separated a lot. But we had to get to know each other all over again.
Right.
Mhm.
There's a part in the book, and I think you guys briefly touched on it in the documentary, where you finally reunite
Mhm.
after being split up for such a long time. What was that like? What was that like for the two of you?
It was 3 years later when I finally ran away from the cult. She ran away when she was 13. I got out when I was 19, but she's younger than me. So Anna's 2.5 years younger than me. So there was 3 years. I was 16 when she ran away, and then I was 19 when I finally did. And I remember reconnecting with her, and she seemed a little bit worldly. She'd been out for a little while. I mean, she listened to music and she dressed a certain way because I had still come from this very, very closed mindset and I was fresh out. So it took me a little while to kind of get used to her again. And I always loved her, but I didn't know how to reconnect with her. But it didn't take us very long.
Because once you leave, I think that's something that people like really, you can see someone leave, right? And you can we can celebrate that person leaving, but then there's this whole process of like having to deconstruct what you experience and then learn this world that you were taught from birth is out to get you.
Evil,
And to
right?
fear. Yes.
Yes. So when I got away, I still believed everything. I ran away because it was so oppressive and so abusive that I just needed a break. I really thought that I would eventually repent and go back. I thought maybe I just wasn't good enough to live that life or strong enough to live that life. The reality was it was incredibly abusive, so oppressive, that I'm surprised I took it as long as I did. But I
Sure.
finally knew for my own emotional well-being, I needed a break from that. And there's certain things I wanted to accomplish, goals that I had, because I was always a reader, even though, we were kept isolated from, worldly things. I was always a reader. So it was like, I wanted certain things for myself as I was 19, and never had a bank account, never had the hopes of ever having a car. Like in the cult, we didn't own anything. Everything
Right.
belonged to the group. Even your clothes could be taken and given to somebody else.
Was it a practice of the United Order?
That's not what we called it, but yeah, we called it the law of consecration.
Okay.
But the problem with the law of consecration is that you have certain people that are in charge of all the things that come in, and those are the ones that get the bulk of everything. Like I said, I own nothing. My family own nothing. The LeBaron wives and children literally could take anything, could be taken from you. Whereas Dan's family, the ones in charge of the funds, he owned 4 homes in his name and in his family names. We couldn't own anything, literally.
That was a part of Anna's book that was briefly discussed on the documentary. I wish they would have gone into more detail.
I mean, they didn't have 12 episodes.
I know they didn't, but talking about how Dan's kids were like, had all the good things. And then you guys are working and working and working, and you're the prophet's daughters.
Was, there are, all are equal. Some are just more equal than others.
Right.
And there's the haves and the have-nots. And it just seemed like because we didn't have a father to look out for us, then we were the have-nots in so many cases.
And it was a communistic type of society. It was communal, but it wasn't at all fair, and it wasn't right. The injustice of it all was so overwhelmingly obvious now that I, look back and see it from a different perspective. Like, I don't blame his children. I do not blame his children. They didn't even know that we were working 12-hour days.
And you're talking about
6 days a week.
specifically Dan Jordan's children.
Dan Jordan's children that were our age.
Yeah.
Who were in the warehouse, maybe 4 hours a week, working side by side with us, but 4 hours a week compared to 70, who were given better clothes, who were given better food, who were actually owned homes. The disparity was really, really extreme.
To me, that I would never blame the children for that.
No.
That falls on Dan.
Right.
Yes.
And
Right.
his wife.
Yeah.
His main wife. Yeah.
Yeah. And they had a responsibility, if they're going to be caring for you, to be providing. And he's and he's working for your dad.
The narrative is that Dan rescued us.
Oh,
gosh.
I would encourage everyone to read Anna's book. You will see how little they were actually rescued.
Right. We were not rescued. We were slave labor for that family.
Yeah.
And he took the greater share for his children. And he should have been providing for his children. He supposedly, I don't know if this is even true, but supposedly he had a degree. He served a mission for the US, for the LDS church that he was converted out of. He was one of the French missionaries that was converted out of the mission field for the LDS church and taken to Celia LeBaron. So I don't know if he would have had a degree, because he would have had to have gotten a full degree before he left on his mission, which is not usual. But supposedly,
it's possible that it could have happened.
Yes. So that's the narrative, is that he had a degree. I'm curious if that's true.
So
but,
your point is that he could have gotten a job with his degree.
He should have gone and provided for his own children, not forced us to provide for them.
This is an underlying problem in these cultures, especially with the men at the top, that I've noticed specifically, is that these guys that are like the quote unquote next in line to God, right? If these guys are so close to God, right, and they're to be revered and they're to be like Jesus, and if you read about Jesus in the Bible, he was very generous.
I agree.
He taught kindness and love.
He taught kindness. He was all about washing the feet of the prostitute and feeding the sick and healing the, and caring for the children.
And the motherless, and I
Yes.
mean the motherless and the fatherless.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So who did these men feel like they were emulating?
I have
Was
that
not
question too.
Jesus.
For sure, it was not Jesus. And I can tell you that there are so many similarities between my father and Joseph Smith that we could talk about that for quite a while. The similarities in the two men.
Ervil,
That actually perfectly leads into the second question I was going to have about.
Then here we go.
Okay. So one thing that really struck me in the docuseries, and which by the way I thought was done so well, and all you and your siblings that all were a part of it, it was so phenomenal to see all of you just like coming together to share your stories. And I loved hearing each one of your points of view. I was obviously like a little bit more I loved your guys' story just because I read Anna's book. So I just kept waiting for that, like those pieces. But what I noticed is that once there was this division in the church, in the fundamentalism, when Joseph Musser passes away, and this huge upheaval between who's the next true key holder, and the division of all of these different men who believe that they are the living prophet. And all of them are waiting for the end of times. And they all believe in their time that the end of times is coming. So my question is, if all of these men believe that the end of times were coming, why does this religion continue? Because every one of them died and Jesus didn't come back.
well, that's what happened to our cult. It finally disintegrated because our dad died. And then we had all these splinter groups, similar thing, all these splinter groups, and everybody's saying, okay, I'm next in line. And Dan Jordan saying, I know I'm the next prophet. And, different people trying to take authority. And then eventually they all end up dead or in prison or gone. And there was nobody left to actually be the prophet. So it had to finally disintegrate. But that doesn't happen with the LDS, the Mormon, or the core religion, because people keep popping up saying they're the next one, they're the prophet, they're the one mighty and strong. Ours finally, because it was so murderous, everybody just ended up dying. So there was no one to carry it on. So we had to all acknowledge, every single one of us had to acknowledge, oh, that was a lot of BS. There was no truth to any of it.
Do you feel in a way like being a part to that and a party to seeing that and witnessing that, did that help you deconstruct your faith when
Absolutely.
it came to Mormonism?
Yes. I mean, we can say with confidence that it's Ervil's children who wanted the violence to stop the most. Once all of us grew to a certain age where psychologically and developmentally we could use our minds for critical thinking and decision making, and the prefrontal cortex is completely online, which happens around age 25. And for many of the ones who were part of it for longer than we were, it happened for them. They came to these conclusions before age 25, while they were still in their late teens, early 20s. And it was them that helped dismantle the whole thing. And in 1992 is when the entire thing completely disintegrated and became non-existent. Now, we understand there's other groups out there that have things and beliefs and whatever, but as far as Ervil LeBaron's children, that no longer exists. And we are grateful that that's something we can say today, because it's rare.
It is rare, because a lot of these other groups, regardless of all of the atrocities that are happening, like say, and I know you guys can't speak to this, but a good example of that would be the FLDS with what Warren Jeffs did. You would assume the guy going to prison for life would end the group. And it just further made the diehards more convicted. And in fairness, a lot of people did leave and it allowed them the space to leave, but they're also now in this like rebuilding phase again. And he's still in prison. And you sit there and you go, how is this possible?
Well,
He still has followers.
here's the good news. Technology and the availability of information is what kind of prevents these things from getting bigger and exploding the way they used to.
That's certainly the hope, Anna. That's certainly the hope.
I feel like there's a huge, I get exactly where you're going with this, because I feel like right now there's been this exodus and finally the truth is coming out about the LDS church. Finally, people are learning about who Joseph Smith was.
Mhm.
And they're realizing, I thought I believed in this guy, but he was actually more like Warren Jeffs. He was more like Ervil LeBaron. He was more like these bad guys.
Yeah. I mean, add Chad
Read back
Daybell
on
to
the
this
teaching.
conversation.
I think for a lot of people, especially those of us that did not grow up in the faith, I grew up Catholic, this whole philosophy that anyone can have a revelation at any single time, and that somehow can completely alter and change the entire framework of the religion.
And they keep
So-
doing it. They keep
They
popping
keep
up.
doing it.
The conversation that needs to be had about this isn't that isn't Ervil LeBaron was evil, wicked, whatever, that people have. The conversation that needs to be had is the original teachings of Joseph Smith about polygamy and Brigham Young
Allow
about
for all
blood
of this.
atonement are the doctrines and teachings of those people, are the source of
Right.
the harm that's being caused today, that was caused until 30 years ago in our group and caused today in other expressions of it. And those early teachings are the source of all that harm.
And
Right.
some of those teachings, while they say they're not a part of the church anymore, you can still find them on the LDS website.
Mhm.
And,
And they won't disavow them.
no,
They try to like scoot under the rug all the violent origins of the LDS faith. The current modern day LDS kind-hearted, good-hearted people who are faithful members of the LDS church may not know these things. And so
Right.
they want to defend their faith,
oh,
and they're doing it probably very genuinely, but because they don't understand.
and they've
And-
been deceived.
And they've been told
Greatly
not to go to any other source for information besides the church. For a high demand religion to require that you not go to another source, I would say you need to question whether this is a high demand religion you're part of when they're controlling your source of information,
Mhm.
and to consider those things. But people that are just good-hearted LDS people who don't understand, we don't have any negative feelings about them at all.
No, I mean,
I mean, it's the people at the higher ups
exactly.
who understand these
The
things.
people that are at the high know what they're doing.
Mhm.
They
And
know what
sweeping
they're
things
to
under
do.
the rug. And it's just not possible anymore in today's information age.
All you have to do is go back and look at the Journal of Discourses. All the teachings of Joseph Smith and Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball and all of the early prophets, they got up and spoke, and everything was recorded and everything that they said. That's why there's so many fundamentalist factions, because they start out as just mainstream modern day LDS believers. And then once they dig a little deeper and they find out what the LDS church was actually founded upon, was all of these things that these fundamentalists keep bringing out into the open, the blood atonement, the Adam God doctrine, the
God, doctor,
the
oh my goodness.
polygamy, all of those things were there. They're distancing themselves from it, and I get why they are, but the foundation is there. And that's why these fundamentalist Mormons just keep popping up and creating havoc, because they are following the original teaching.
Right, and they're going into the Doctrine and Covenants, and they're reading 132, and 132 is so clear that the only way to the celestial kingdom is through plural marriage.
And then it's repeated over and over and over and over again in those Journal of Discourses, which
Yeah.
people don't always have access to anymore.
A lot of people, well, at least the people that are getting converted today, the missionaries that are teaching them are not giving them this information,
and
they
so
don't
many-
even, and many of them don't even know it.
they don't even realize the racist roots either.
Oh, right.
And a lot of them are now converting in Africa, and I'm like, what about when they find out how racist it used to be? I mean, I was taught
in many
super
ways-
racist ideas. I was literally taught that you couldn't be 1/16 African American, and if you were even 1/16, like it was distasteful. Like you couldn't have anything to do with them. You couldn't marry someone. Anyway,
You had to protect your seed, right?
right.
And that
So-
whole thing about being white and delightsome,
right.
that is extremely racist.
Mm-hmm.
They've
And
changed
we
they've changed the
disavow
language.
that.
Yes, we disavow that. They've changed that language though to pure and delightsome, but it used to be white and delightsome. Even speaking of, we were supposed to, the way we were taught was we were supposed to marry into Latino families to help bring out the white.
Oh my God.
Like, I know.
It's like,
But I can just say I denounce the racist teachings
Just to be
completely.
very,
I mean,
very
that's a
clear.
very hard conversation for a lot of people to have because it's so hidden. Because the polygamists that you see in the public that are out will never say it. They'll never show you that side of themselves publicly.
But all of those things, all those really negative things that are the world today knows is not healthy or good or beneficial in society were entrenched and embedded in the original Mormon doctrines.
Baked in from the start.
And so when the both of you come out of this, what is it like to have to learn when you were taught as a child that you're not supposed to associate with anyone that isn't 100% white? What is it like to learn that that's all a lie?
Well, I guess I should speak to that since Anna wasn't as brainwashed. She got out when she was just 13, so that didn't get as entrenched in her. I just know when I got out, I was super confused and I still had all these ideas and notions. And I literally had to sift through every time I had a thought. I had to say, is that what I really believe and feel? Or is that what I was taught to believe and feel? And I had to really shift my whole thinking, and trust me, becoming unbrainwashed and deconstructing is a very, very difficult, long process. I still have to sometimes sit there and say, okay, wait a second. I mean, is this really a kind way to believe? Is this really good for humanity? And I have a grown daughter who is a therapist. She has a master's in psychology, and I talk through things with her, and she sets me straight still to this day about, okay, yeah, that's really, I think, part of your programming still stuck. And I just have to be like open to that and saying that I want every shred of that taken out of my thinking.
One thing that I've noticed about these cultures is this superiority complex that they give everyone, where you are the one chosen people and you are going to be the ones that march in, you know, when Jesus comes and he's chosen you to do the work of the gospel and you are the best. How do you unravel that when you leave?
It's just part of that process again of just taking every single thought. Like we were told we were born in the covenant, that we were celestial spirits that, you know, embodied celestial spirits that came from, you know, pre-existence. And I was taught I was a princess in my father's kingdom. And you're taught all that, and yet you're treated horribly.
Cognitive dissonance.
So it's very confusing, even when you're in, to think, oh, I'm not that special, I'm not that great. And then, you know, you have to come out of it and just find your own actual authentic person and your own authentic self.
I mean, it's taken me a lot of years, and you know, I got out when I was 13, and I was a grown adult in my mid-20s, I think 27, I believe, if I'm mathing correctly, when I went to a professional therapist for the first time. From 1995 to 2000, I spent time with this professional therapist who had, you know, her specialized in cults. And it took 5 years of me to get to the place where I could just have emotions. I was so shut down and my emotions were so suppressed, just as a survival coping mechanism, survival mechanism.
Right.
Just you shut it all down and you don't get to have your feelings about anything, and you just soldier on and live your life as best you can. And it took me 5 years of working with her before I could actually cry and grieve. And when I went to her, you know, I had talked to my dad in my whole lifetime 2 times, and I did not think I needed to work through anything with my dad. And, you know, the first day in therapy, she says, you know, tell me about your relationship with your dad. And I was like, well, he was never around and we dealt with it. That was like one sentence like that was my entire summation of my relationship with my dad. But 5 years into it, after doing what she calls peeling back the layers of that onion to get to the core. And when I got to that core, what was buried underneath was the grief that I carried over not having experienced what it was like to have a father. And I sobbed and sobbed in therapy for months over not like, I didn't miss my dad. I didn't have any emotional attachment to him, but what I was grieving, what was should have been and wasn't.
Yeah,
and
because
those are real losses.
massive losses. The one thing that really strikes me about, you know, many in this culture, but specifically with your dad, was his complete lack of connection to any of his children and really not even knowing his kids. I was stunned when you were writing in your book about making coffee, and I was imagining these little legs getting up and making the coffee on the, you know, in this old rickety house and never knowing how to do it, but then he liked the coffee. So then you're so proud to give him more coffee.
Yes.
And
I mean, the sound of a pan of boiling water when you start to pour it and you hear that sizzle brings me back to that moment every single time.
When your dad was one of the interesting components of your book that they touched on a little bit in the docuseries, again, they should have had 12 episodes, was his manic writing. Have you looked at these journals to see what was he spending his time? What did he think he was doing with all of this writing with these tablets? And
Well, in the early days, he wrote a lot of pamphlets and a lot of letters to people in the LDS Church, to other fundamentalist Mormon groups, to the President of the United States and the Vice President of the United States, and a lot of doctrine. Like I have tons and tons and tons of his early work and his pamphlets. A lot of doctrine was written that was coherent and made a lot of sense. I think what you're talking about was when he was in prison. And after he got convicted, he had a manic episode, like he had a psychotic break when he got convicted. And then he was writing and writing and writing. And I think even staying up all night and writing and writing. And it was a lot of revelations that he was writing to, again, some of the fundamentalist Mormons. It was to people in his family, to his children, to his wives, to authorities, to the warden, to the you know, I mean, he had something to say that was quote unquote revelation from God to so many people. And it was those writings that were compiled into those revelations that were compiled into a book of sorts, just spiral bound, that became named the Book of the New Covenant, which is the book that everybody's afraid of getting into the wrong hands and someone picking it up and carrying on some of the deeds in there. But I own a copy of it. And let me just tell you, it is not doctrine. It is not a religion to follow. It is not anything that's coherent or that anybody would pick up and say, oh, let's start carrying out more blood atonements because it says so in here. Because it was rantings. It was desperate rantings of a madman and not a religious doctrine to follow by any means.
You know what, when I look at the story of your father and the fact that, you know, his grandfather there was like 7 boys. Was there 7?
7 brothers. I think there was 7 brothers that
At least 7 brothers, yeah.
And I believe at one time, each one of them felt like they were the one in the mighty.
Oh,
The one
unfortunately,
Well,
the one mighty and strong is a very fundamentalist a phenomenon. And many different ones have come and claimed that. And it was claimed, I don't know if every one of them, but there were multiple of my father's brothers that, along with him, that claimed that they were the one mighty and strong. That's such a toxic doctrine. It frightens me. If anybody ever uses that term, go far away from it.
Or if someone says they literally speak to God and God is speaking through them, that would be another warning sign. I mean, I think
go be prayerful. If you are a believer in prayer, go be prayerful for yourself. Don't be trying to dictate what other people are going to do with that's a big red flag.
I believe it was your cousin, Stephanie Spencer, was on the docuseries, and she has written quite a bit about sort of the family lines and the mental illness within the group. do you believe that your father had some level of mental health issues or like psychosis or psychopathy or?
No doubt about it.
I mean,
I'm
we
not a
cannot
therapist.
we cannot diagnose
Right.
it.
I'm not expecting you to diagnose this.
But
I'm
the-
saying this from Anna, sorry, I'm saying this from a non-professional perspective, but I don't think there's any doubt that there is mental illness that runs in the LeBaron bloodline.
there's nobody with any type of credentials who would examine the evidence and say he was mentally sound.
Right.
It's just, it would be irresponsible to have any kind of outcome besides he was for sure not mentally sound while he was in prison, and probably for some time before that. You can't be making the kinds of decisions that he was making from a sound, healthy mental state.
Well, yeah,
I
I've
do
been
believe
writing
he-
letters to the president demanding that he tithe to his church, you know?
Correct.
I do believe that he sincerely thought he was a prophet of God. I do believe that. I don't think he was just pretending, trying to get power. I think he believed his own lie.
But the power did go to his head.
For sure.
You know, the thing, you know, they say anytime you have things that go wrong, you know, it's power, sex, and money. And
Yeah.
all three of those things were evidenced in the religious cult we were raised in.
If there's even a crack of mental illness there, I feel like this belief system just exploits all of that
Mhm.
because it gives people the lane, the vehicle to be like, well, I'm the God.
And
Mhm.
and it's not Ervil's teachings per se.
No, it's
the
Joseph's-
original teachings.
Correct.
So-
Your dad was not the originator of any of this.
Mm-mm.
He
He
was
just-
one of
He
many
picked it
that-
up and ran with it.
right.
And took it off into a very, very terrible direction.
Mhm.
So you only met him or only had very few interactions with him, Anna. What was your relationship like with your father, Celia?
I was a little bit older, so Anna says she met him when she was 9, and I get that. It was just her memory of meeting him was started when she was 9. But when we were littler, we did, and I wanted to go back and say too, because you mentioned he didn't have relationships with his children. We're like in the middle of the pack, but he
Oh.
had a lot of older children. They did have relationships with him and
Okay.
actually loved him and have very kind memories and lovely memories of him as a kind-hearted person. So just because we were so far down, like, I don't know where I was number 25 out of 51 or something. I don't really even know that number. But I was like in the middle. And so by then he had so many children and was running from the loss so much that there was very little interaction. So no, I did not have a real relationship with him especially when I was older. When I was younger, I have good memories of him. When he would come to the house, which wasn't often even then, he would take the little ones and very sweetly bounce them on his knee and put us on his back and jiggle us down like a slide because he was really tall and we were little tinies. And we just thought that was super fun. And but then as soon as he was done with all of that, you know, little moments of kindness, he was, you know, go back into the mode of I'm the prophet, everybody stay quiet. We were always hushed and shushed when he was around. I'm sure we were a loud pack of kids. So
I mean,
for him
there
to
was
get any
probably 20 of
writing-
us in the house.
So for any, you know, for him to accomplish any of his writings and stuff, which was always a super high priority for him, we were constantly hushed and relegated to other rooms that were far from his. So it was mostly still distance.
So there was a period of time, obviously, when he was still before his dad passed away, Alma, right? Was that your
His
grandfather?
father was Alma. Mhm.
Alma. I'm so sorry. I'm from the Midwest. So like, I'm always.
It's probably pronounced both ways, you know, in
Yeah.
Spanish it's Alma.
Yeah. So once he passes away and he passes this on to Joel, and then Joel and your father end up starting the Church of the Firstborn.
Mhm. Of the fullness of
The
times.
fullness of times. How long were they together before Ervil splits off for his own group?
Couple of
I don't
decades,
even know
maybe?
exactly when 10 years probably. I don't know. I don't remember
When-
the exact date that the Church of the Firstborn of the fullness of times was established, but it was my dad working in conjunction with his brother Joel, and Joel being the one who inherited the mantle from, well, we called him Dyer. His name was, anyway, from their father. And then Ervil, of course, the power went to his head a little bit, and he started trying to usurp more and more power over the organization. And what's really, really sad is that Ervil and Joel were, my understanding is when they were younger, they were like best friends and loved each other a lot. But this power that Joel had, that Ervil wanted, it was the downfall of the Church of the Firstborn. And at some point, our dad decided that Joel was a false prophet and that he was the actual true prophet. And when Joel wouldn't step down and, you know, hand his followers over to Ervil, Ervil had him executed.
Did you know Joel?
I barely have one little memory. What in my mind was Joel, but it was standing, because I was only 3 when we left Colonia LeBaron, which is where we were born. We were born in that in the Church of the Firstborn. And we had, you know, we lived in Mexico and they had actual churches and stuff, or at least one church and a building, which we never had growing up in the Church of the Lamb of God. But I remember standing in the pews, and somebody who I think was my Uncle Joel was standing beside me, and very, very sweetly, I think I was probably 2.5. We were singing, and my mom got up and went to the, went to lead the music, and Uncle Joel took the hymnal and set it down, lowered it so that he's very, he was a tall grown man, and he lowered it so that I could read and follow along in the singing. And that's my only memory. And I believe it was Uncle Joel. In my mind, it was Uncle Joel, but very sweetly. And so I was just mouthing these words because of course I couldn't read, but he put it down there so I could just, follow along with him and sing. So that's the only memory I think is of Uncle Joel.
And you wouldn't remember him, Anna. You were so young. Yeah.
I was 9 months old when we left the colony. But what I wanted to say is that as far as Wikipedia is concerned, and we know it's fraught with some errors, that the Church of the Firstborn of the Fullness of Times was founded September 21st, 1955. So about 15 years that they were together.
It's fascinating to hear from the actual people involved, because it's very easy when you read about this and you consume it to put people in like a box and not look at the humanity of it, right? And it's easy to look at Ervil and say he was evil, but he didn't start that way. And all of these men in some capacity did things that were not the best, especially to women. It's just very fascinating to hear that aspect. So when the Church of the Lamb of God, which was your father's branch, splits, he takes about 150, 100.
I've heard it was fewer than that, like 125.
Okay.
Just to several of the families, and then most of his wives, but several of the families broke off with him. The Shanakhs, the Rioses, the Sarates, the Jordans. Those are some of the families that broke off with him.
Okay, and that split was like, did you say 1970? It's
72?
The late 60s, early 70s.
Okay.
Like my mom left the LeBaron colony when I was 9 months old in 1969.
Okay.
And that was when the chasm between them had widened so much that they felt they had to leave.
I was looking through some of Rulon Allred's old writings because I wanted to see where this connection came from and how did this all come together. And it felt like when I was reading through this time, now in the documentary, it appears as though in one breath he's targets Rulon to get to Verlin. But there was also an ongoing dispute between Rulon and the LeBarons about who was the prophet.
I don't know about anything on Rulon's side being a rival of Ervil.
Well,
I've only ever known that Ervil was considered Rulon a rival.
So I do want to say that they were friendly back way in the day. That at one point when Rulon was wanted for polygamy, that he did go down to the colony in Mexico, in Chihuahua, and live there with the LeBarons as a friend. and took refuge there. So that's why Verlin and Rulin were friendly and cared about one another. My dad knew Verlin would not miss the funeral for Rulin Allred because they were friendly and they had connection. Anyway.
So it appears that I was looking through his old writings, and he actually in 1974 wrote about Joel's passing. And he said there was the terrible death of Joel LeBaron, who was killed by his brother and associates some time ago, and they were arrested and imprisoned. The Supreme Court reversed the decision and turned them loose. I've been told that this was the result of a $20,000 bribery in which they paid this much in order to get this decision. I do not know whether that's true.
Well, I would say even just to correct what's already in error there.
Yeah.
It wasn't the Supreme Court because this was tried in Mexico.
Right. Well, this is Rulin, this is his
Yes.
writing.
Right.
But he was in jail for a year and went to trial and was convicted. And then shortly after that conviction for his brother Joel, it did get overturned. And I don't know how that happened. So that it was a bribe is it's possible. I don't know how it happened, but he was convicted and then let go.
So at this point, what Rulin is talking about is that they're free now, right? And he is hearing about some stuff from people down in Mexico about Ervil's whispers about what he wants to do to other people. And this was in 1974.
Mm-hmm.
And he was telling his congregation that they didn't really take it too seriously, but they did realize that Ervil had marked their group, and that
sent letters to them calling them to repentance and telling them to turn over his flock and to pay tithing to him. I do know that.
Like this is just an example. He said, though they have sworn that they are going to kill the council, they have particularly mentioned two of that council. I have the firm assurance that we are in the hands of God. So Rulin didn't believe that anything bad was going to happen. And he said, no man is going to take our lives unless the Lord wants us to be killed. And I don't think he wants that to happen. I haven't the slightest fear of any of this coming to harm us.
Oh, that's too bad. I'm sorry he felt safe like that. He wasn't.
I do think that sensible precautions can be made, but while we are in attendance and seeing that nobody comes in that we don't want to hear is in order. So they were talking about having he got the police involved, and he had, we're going to be very careful about who comes to our meetings, received crank calls. We're aware that this is happening, but I think we'll be safe. And, he believed that because he believed he was speaking to God, and he believed that God was telling him that he was safe.
Right.
And
everybody wants to feel safe.
Yeah.
And wants to believe they're safe. That's a human condition, wanting to believe.
Who wants to live in that kind of fear?
Well, in Rulin's writings, he is very clear that the LeBarons are misguided, and he is the prophet, not them.
Right.
And he calls Joel a false prophet. Mm-hmm. And he calls Ervil a false prophet. And it did seem there was a level of sort of the men, sort of all like, I'm the prophet, I'm the prophet, I'm the prophet.
Well, that's because there can only be one mighty and strong.
According to the Mormon doctrine, the original Mormon teachings, there can be only one who can speak to God for the whole organization. So anybody else that's speaking up for others is going to be a false prophet in that narrative.
And it seems like they're all just fighting for power. It's very...
Some fighting harder than others. Like
right.
our father was literally scrambling and fighting to try to gain all the power. And in his grandiosity, he believed he had the authority to go and take it by force. Didn't work out very well for him.
No. So a lot of the book and the documentary, a lot of it is about all of you kids being on the move all the time and not understanding why you were moving all the time and what was going on. And none of you seemed to have any clue of what was happening.
Not the young ones. We didn't understand what was happening. We were taught that we were running away from persecution, that, it's biblical. It's very documented that the God's chosen people will get the brunt of persecution from all those evil outsiders. So we were taught to always be very, very afraid of anybody on the outside, particularly authorities. But even we were taught to be afraid of neighbors and teachers and, you know, kind people. And so one of the things I want to say, I don't want to forget to say this, is that if you think someone is part of a cult, or, you know, being enclosed like that in a tight organization, the best thing you can do for them to give them doubts is to just show them so much kindness, because it was really, really hard to hate these teachers and to think badly of them when they were just so loving and so kind. So it actually gave you this little glimmer of, you know, oh, is what we're hearing really true? You know, that was.
They always say to plant little, like, they always say to plant little seeds, and like,
yes,
maybe one of those
kindness
will grow.
Don't just lump them in as evil. You know, all the people, the young people part of that cult, it's not their fault. It's just like, just help plant the seed of kindness and love so that they can have a little bit of trust to the outside world, even though that is what they're taught not to do.
Well, going back to what the moving around all the time and not understanding why you were moving, I think the documentary did a very good job of humanizing what it was like for a child, and doing those recreations of getting on a bus, on a like box truck, and and being told that you're leaving when you're a child, going through all of these upheavals and constant faces and coming in and out and revolving doors of adults that are in your life and out of your life. What does that do to your own sense of security in developing healthy relationships once you leave as an adult?
It affected every part of it.
Devastating.
There was no way around it affecting your current life. I mean, I'm still in therapy.
I love, but it was like you got used to the rug being pulled out from under you all the time.
You know, like one of the things I'm talking about with my current therapist that we discussed this week is this constant need to be on high alert. Even though I live in a safe place, in a safe community, there's been no life for decades. You know, I mean, I don't think there was ever my life specifically, but it felt that way. You know, so fear was ingrained. And so I'm currently working with a therapist about a little piece of having some agoraphobia, of being afraid of being outdoors.
I can see that.
I didn't feel safe outdoors. We weren't allowed to play outside. We were taught that the outside world is evil and wicked, and the nosy neighbors will turn us into the police. So kids, you're having 20 kids in a house and you're not allowed to play outside.
The landlord will find
out being outside. And it's still something that affects me to this day, even though I have been through all of this healing, all of this, you know, and I think that you heal in layers. And that this little piece of it that I couldn't even acknowledge 25 years ago, you know, but now we're here. And guess what? Now we're unpacking this. And so the process of healing is a long one.
And one of the things that we're really proud of is that we were raised in this, you know, very transient existence. And yet we've created for our children stability.
Yes.
Like my children went through a school system from kindergarten to graduation. Anna's children did too.
Not the same school. I homeschooled my kids at first. And then,
right.
And then, but we lived in the same house for 17 years. And all 5 of my kids graduated from the same high school. So I would say of all my accomplishments in my life, giving my children the stability that I did not have has to be up there as one of the greatest.
It's you've broken a generational trauma that you didn't place onto your children. And that is a huge accomplishment.
Yeah. And the other one, I would say maybe even greater than that, like our mother sacrificed every one of her 12 children on the altar of her religion.
Yeah.
And I have not done that. My children do not believe the same way I do. And guess what? I support them in their choices wholeheartedly.
Yeah.
That they get to create the life for themselves that they want, not the one I imagined for them for 18 years while they were minors. And I think that is 100% a break from like what our parents taught us.
Freedom of thought.
I love that. I
Mhm.
love
And
that.
so even though I'm still healing and still in the process, I was able to do way better than my parents, but obviously the bar was set
Really
so
low.
Really
low. It
low.
was not hard to jump over that.
Yeah, I mean, that was another component of the docuseries that I think really did sort of get touched on briefly, was the betrayal of your mother, of her not sticking up for you, her not
Yeah.
being
Had
there
no
for you, but
power.
then also the empathy you had towards her, of understanding that she was also a victim in all of this.
She
How
was a
do you-
victim, and she wasn't a really strong-minded woman. She was kind-hearted and loving, but she didn't have the strength to stand up to anything for her children, even though she loved us, she couldn't stand up for us at all.
And
So
look
we
at
suffered.
us. Look at us now, standing up for our children,
Mhm.
being strong, being vocal, finding our voices, finding our power, coming into our lives, creating these lives that we're proud of, and then giving our children opportunities that we would have never dreamed of that were possible. Just all the ways that we've created good and overcome every obstacle that was placed in our path.
It's incredible.
All of them. And I want to just go into that a little bit.
Sure.
I don't know that the average person who hasn't experienced these things can really understand the depth of the harm that was caused. And I don't know if you're familiar with the ACEs test, the adverse childhood experiences.
Yes.
Okay, so there's like, you take this test and there's 10 adverse childhood experiences they talk about. They studied these for health reasons. And they said there's a correlation between these ACEs and health in later life. So these were the 10 that they studied. I scored a 9 out of 10.
I was gonna say, that sounds
And
a
the
lot.
only reason I didn't score a 10 is because we didn't do drugs and alcohol.
I was gonna say,
But we experienced religious oppression, and that's
right.
why we
I mean, I
didn't
feel
do
like, yeah, I feel like with
But-
I feel like with the faith, there's this like intoxication you get from the faith that that replaces getting
Yes.
drunk.
Very good point.
Yes.
That's their high, is
Yeah.
the religion.
But here's the next part that I want to go into. I thought about those things, and in our family,
And we said, that's not enough. There's a lot
like-
more.
they don't even know that is not even the half of what we experienced, not even a
Right.
fraction.
Right.
And if I was making my list, I said these were the things that we experienced. So I'm gonna,
Addition.
in addition to those, childhood developmental trauma, religious trauma or spiritual abuse, egregious educational neglect, medical, dental, all kinds of neglect. I didn't get glasses until I was in 6th grade, and I'm blind as a bat. Starvation, food insecurity, child slave labor, and financial abuse, severe isolation from societal influences, severe familial isolation, severe brainwashing or indoctrination, groomed to accept and become polygamists. And then our family specifically groomed to become, I call them hit children, because hit men and hit women references adults. And that's not what was happening.
Yeah.
Hit children, I think that a better term is child soldiers.
Sure.
I
It
don't
really
think that's
did
too
feel like,
strong.
yeah, no, when you guys were talking about being trained and with the weapons, and you're preparing for end times and doing horrible things to people, that's a level of psychological terror to put on a child
Right.
that I cannot fathom.
And just so you know, Anna and I never perpetrated anything.
Oh, no,
So I just want to make that clear, because you're saying you and our group did.
no,
for
yeah,
sure.
I'm sorry.
But I just want to, in case anybody's listening and saying,
Oh,
what did
yeah.
they do? I just want to make sure they know we never, that's why we can speak up. We're not afraid of anything getting done up about
Right,
us.
no,
'Cause we were one of the lucky ones.
yeah,
Right.
I was speaking to the part where they were talking about the weapons that were brought in, and the sort of
Yeah.
this militia training that was done,
We
which is
were
actually
trained.
done in other groups to this day.
Yeah.
Um,
We were trained to grow up and be soldiers for God and to carry out blood atonements. It's drilled into us from the time I was 6 or 7. I remember I had to be prepared to kill for God.
how do you, there's
I don't believe in God anymore, so no God can tell me
no, what
to
I
kill
was gonna
anybody,
say
thankfully.
is, when you're a child growing up like that, and you touched on something, Anna, that I think is so important, that when I speak about polygamy and interview people, one huge theme that just comes from so many survivors is the lack of all these people around them, but the lack of actual intimate connections. And children dealing with moms that are sad because they're all fighting for dad's attention. Dad's never around. They're dealing with impoverished conditions. They might be dealing with depression from having to have babies every single year, all these different layers. You have all these kids that are not being properly supervised. And
I mean, neglect was a thing. Egregious neglect of the children.
how do you think?
You were either like so controlled in a warehouse, forced to work, supervised every minute. And then other times in our lives, I remember no one was really looking out for us at all. And me and my other sister, not Anna, but another sister, were like little children in Mexico just going to the park by ourselves. You know, I mean, when we weren't old enough to work, there was a lot of neglect.
And you basically were labor trafficked by
Sure.
this group. What level of education do you believe you were at when you, Anna, when you left at 13 and you went into school at that point, right? Were you at grade level at that point?
So let me explain. When we were, when I was young, I did go to kindergarten and I went to first grade, I went to second grade, but I went to pieces of those because we never stayed anywhere long. But I remember being in kindergarten, I remember being in first grade. I have little memories of second grade, and third grade was hugely important to me. And there's a whole chapter in my book about my third grade teacher. And then I went to maybe a few weeks of fourth grade. And then we moved from Denver to Houston. In Houston, because of my age, I was put in sixth grade. So I missed all of fourth, all of fifth. And so just the educational gaps and neglect that happened, you know, when I started in that little private school, they had a system of, you know, where they would test you. And then wherever you had gaps, they would fill in the gaps for you with what they called PACEs. So that was the way that I was able to fill in the gaps and graduate with a high school diploma. It was an unaccredited school, but it was a legitimate diploma because I earned it by doing all the back work. I had to do all this back work of filling in the gaps before I could start at my actual grade level.
But each of Ervil's children had a different story about their education level. Like we moved around. Yeah, we moved around so much. I completely skipped years of school, and then we would be put back in school, and I had to kind of make up and scramble. I was always a reader. Anna and I both were always really big readers, so that was super helpful for, you know, language arts, not so great for the math aspect. But other of our siblings, I was really lucky. I was a very devout girl. I wasn't trying to date boys in high school. I wasn't trying to do drugs. I wasn't getting into any kind of trouble. I was just really, really studious. So I was allowed to go to school more than others. But many of our siblings didn't go past second, third, fourth grade before they were taken out. Yeah, but some girls too. Like that didn't get to go past, you know, like I said, second, third, fourth grade before they were full-time slave labor in the warehouse, the 12-hour days, 6 days a week. Now, when I was in school, when I was allowed to go to school, and I loved school, so I always advocated to go to school. I wanted so badly. I loved school. Even when I was in school, I had to go to work after school and all day on Saturday. So I was still a slave, but I did get to go do my studies too.
So go into a little bit more detail about you had to work until 11 or 12 at night, then do your homework, and then go to school the next day on 3 hours of sleep, you know?
So it was always different, but one of the jobs I had was doing pickups. I would pick up the old used appliances with my little brother Hiram, who was the muscle. He was 12, and he was the muscle. And I was the
12-year-old is the muscle.
12-year-old.
And he was in Hiram was in the series, right?
He was in the documentary with
us. It was like, so I was like, oh, Hiram's in here.
Yes, he's my little brother, and I always consider him my first baby because I was 6 years older than him. And I remember standing there and asking my mom, what's his name again? You know, when I was a little tiny girl. And I asked her when she was expecting him, he was born in February and my birthday was in May. I said, if he's born on my birthday, can I keep him? Of course, there was no chance of that, but my mom was like, yeah, you can have him. If he's born on your birthday, he'll be your birthday present. There was no hope of it, but I always felt very, very maternal towards him. And I just loved the idea of a little baby. But anyway, so he was 12 and I was like 17, 18. We did pickups together. Oh yeah. After I got out of school, I would have to set my route, go find all the places I had to go pick up these used appliances, put Hiram in the car. He always had a book with him. He was a little book nerd too. So while I was driving, he was usually reading. And unless I needed help finding someplace, my direction sense is not great. So he would sometimes help me find where we're going. But anyway, we'd go pick up a load of big truck full of appliances and get it back to the warehouse and unload it. And sometimes I would be so tired, I would have to stop and like take a nap in the warehouse before we unloaded the truck. And then drive home and go to bed and get back up and go to work in the morning. And I didn't have time really to do homework. So my first class was a sewing class. And so I would skip that class, go to the typing room, type up whatever my homework was on my paper or whatever for, my English class, which was always my priority. And then make up my sewing class during lunch. And my sewing teacher would sometimes come into the typing class and be like, what are you doing in here? And I'm like, oh, I have to get this done, because they didn't understand my situation. But she was very kind. As long as I went and made up the sewing that I had to do during lunch, then she let me get away with that. When I always had to maneuver it. It was always a maneuvering, trying to do it all.
And again, what you were referencing, what you said earlier about the kindness that people showed you that made such a difference.
I was such a good student and I always wanted to do well, and they just could see that my intentions were always good. And I did explain that I worked. They didn't understand I was just a slave, but I had a job. And so she was very, very kind. Yeah, teachers are really, Anna and I always say,
teachers and librarians.
Yes, are the best.
There's so many like mandated reporters around, and like one of the components, which sort of leads into one of the things I wanted to ask you about, was being taught to lie from the time that you're born. The lie to protect polygamy, to protect the family, to protect everything. The documentary we were just supposed to answer, I don't know. I don't know.
Yes.
I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah.
How do you, when you're taught to lie so easily about everything, what is it like to come into not like letting that part of, go and realizing, wait a minute, they told me I couldn't trust these people and they were really wanting me to lie because what was happening was bad. What does that do to your mind when you realize, oh my goodness, like I was lying, thinking I was lying for good, but I was actually not lying for good.
Right. So you have to unpack that too. So after I got out, when I had children of my own, I remember I wouldn't even teach them Santa Claus, because I'm like, I am never intentionally telling my kids a lie about anything ever, because I was lied to so much and had to lie so much, and taught that it was for good, like you said, when it really wasn't. It was to protect the organization. It's really hard to come from, oh, everybody's the enemy on the outside, to like getting out and you're like, wow, people are actually really, really nice. People are great. Like we have people sometimes, I in my job, I sometimes have people come and I sit with them and, in banking, and they'll tell me, how the world is just a terrible place. And I'm like, oh, really? I just think the world is great. Now that I'm out in the world, where most people are so imperfect, but really, really great and kind. And that's my experience. So I'm really glad to have a different perspective and a more optimistic perspective about humanity than I used to have.
Sad to think that that any child would grow up in that capacity. So to come through like what you ladies have come through, it's tremendous. You've gone through such tough experiences and have found a way to overcome so much. When your father is finally, after Ruland's passing, and then he's finally, I believe, convicted and goes to prison. Does life change at all for you? By that point, you were out, Anna, right?
No, when my dad was in prison, I was still part of it.
Oh, you were still part of it. Is
And
that when
Jordan.
Dan sort of came in and was making you guys?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, we already were slave labor for
Okay.
Dan Jordan while our father was in prison, or even before that when he was running from the law. We were under Dan Jordan many, many, many years. So while our dad was on the run, while our dad was in prison, after our dad died, he was the one that was over us for the most part. And let me just tell you, when my dad died, things got worse before they got better, because there were all these people now that were saying, I'm next in line, I'm next in line, I'm next in line. And then it became the most dangerous our cult ever became for us was during that time.
And that's the period too when everyone, that group decides they need to fulfill your dad's prophecies and finish his hit list, per se.
Yes. That's when his young children took his rantings, his all his revelations that he had while he was writing, while he was in prison, and thought they had to carry them out because no one else would do it. The adults who had been part of, under Ervil, were saying, this is not making sense. What he's writing isn't coherent. It's very, very much more violent than it ever was.
Yeah.
And they were not following those teachings anymore. So Ervil put it upon his young teenage kids to go, these brainwashed kids that's all they ever knew, and gave them all of those teachings and sent them to go do it all.
But I want to add something here, Celia, that's I think very important for the listeners to understand. Is when my dad went to prison, by this time, the people that had been teenagers when they were carrying out the hits, Mark and Dwayne and Ed and all them, they were now in their 20s, early to mid 20s, where their prefrontal cortex is online and they can decide things and have discretion and discernment, decision making. And then they're all starting to go, wait a minute, this is not good. This is not working. There's something really, really wrong with
started to have questions about Ervil's.
Yeah. And so all of them were able to come out of that and then think critically about what was happening and decide to choose a different path for themselves. And many of them did choose different paths, which them choosing those different paths caused them to become, targets.
Apostates. They become apostates.
But also the children that took up the mantle, if you want to call it that were teenagers at the time, also when they got to be young adults in their late teens and early 20s, they also became aware that this was not good, that these things that were happening were not good. And it was those siblings of ours who dismantled the entire thing, the entire cult in 1992. They were part of the KG.
The ones who were originally following the teachings and trying to carry them out are the ones that said, whoa, wait a second. No, this doesn't make any sense, when they got their brains online.
And so we know now that, by psychologists and developmental people who study these things, that in your early 20s to 25, usually it's at age 25. And age 25 is for people who have been raised in a good, healthy environment. That long list I read meant that probably all of us were emotionally and psychologically, developmentally stunted. For sure. And so the fact that they all in an early 20s age or younger said no more and shut the whole thing down and set everyone free in 1992, almost miraculous.
Yeah, it's incredible.
I don't even know how they were able to come to those conclusions with that kind of conviction, because I know how long it took me to unravel all of that.
Yeah.
But they were so convinced of it that they themselves actively stood up and said, no more, this has got to stop.
So your siblings that participated in the infamous
4 o'clock murders,
the 4 o'clock murders,
were the ones who went in 1992 and dismantled the whole thing.
They weren't in prison yet. They began dismantling it before they were caught. But then they were finally caught. And then one of them
turned himself in. Knowing,
because he's like, no one else is going to die. I'll be the last one to die because I'll get the death penalty, but I'm going to tell the truth.
So the 4 o'clock What year was that again?
1988,
Okay, that's what I thought. Your dad passed away
81.
81. Okay. And by 92, they're
The
not.
en-
They all were aware that this was baloney and they weren't going to follow it anymore.
I don't think baloney is a strong enough word.
Not a strong enough word. Can I keep saying bullshit?
Of course.
They recognized it.
I don't
And
mean to laugh, but I'm laughing at.
No, I mean, that's
we do laugh about dark things sometimes. It's a
Yeah.
good release.
I imagine the little Mormon girl in you that would like never would have cursed, and that's why-
Never.
Oh,
That's
yeah.
right.
You know, I say, I love Jesus and I cuss a little.
I love that.
Anyway, but yes, they figured it out for themselves without, I mean, I'm shocked. They were super intelligent. And so even though this is what they were brainwashed into, they were able to come to that conclusion for themselves and stop it.
And so,
But it was after they'd already committed a lot of atrocities. So they did end up going to
how many
prison.
people died on the day of the 4 o'clocks? Was that
Or
4? Okay. And were there other ones after that they participated in?
So
Well,
we're missing Dan Jordan. He was actually murdered for the 4 o'clock murders.
Okay.
right.
So, but it was by the KOG, those teenagers.
And
That's
so
the group that they were
it-
talking about that started teaching these, and some of the sons.
Right.
Your brother Heber, right?
Yeah.
He's serving a life sentence in prison.
How many of your siblings are in prison today?
There's a handful.
There's
And again, how do you call it? What do you call a sibling?
Is it
And
a
a
s-
half or a
the
full or a
half, or is it a
step or
step?
whatever?
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
So
there are multiple.
again, it was dismantled in 1992,
Mhm.
and then in 2001, so 9 years later, I moved to a city where many of the KOGers had had been for 10 former KOGers. Thank you. So in 2001, I moved to this certain city and don't realize that I'm moving into where they all live. Well,
And
not
we
all
were
of them,
always
but
in
many
fear
of them.
We
And
always
I
had-
I was afraid of them for many years. But I had heard rumors and stuff that, that they had been taken in and finished raised by Rena. And I knew Rena was a safe person because she had denounced the whole thing in early 81. And when she went to Ervil's prison cell and said, "I'm divorcing you,"
Rena
And-
Chenoweth?
Shanoff, yeah.
Mhm.
Not, I'm sorry.
And so she completely disavowed Ervil, earlier than a lot of people, really.
Right.
And she was the one that actually went into Rulin's, and
She was the one that pulled the trigger.
and she
was
unloaded the gun.
Yeah,
She was
another
a puppet for Ervil. This
She was
was
a
nothing
child.
she would have ever done. She was 19. Her
Right.
brain was still scrambled.
I mean, she was arrested by Ervil at 12,
Yeah.
forced into an arranged marriage with him as a
16.
plural wife at 16. And again, when we talk about Rena and the people that listen to you and your show here, we recognize that there's a lot of people who view her and her life from a very different lens than the one we do.
Right.
And I want to acknowledge that before we continue this conversation, because it's so important to us to have these nuanced discussions.
Nuanced situation, because she's in many ways, and that's really what I did like about this documentary, is helping people understand the complexities of what it's like to be in a cult where you're not the shot caller, and if you don't obey, there's consequences. And everyone can become a perpetrator, but it's not a willing perpetration. It's a
Exactly.
I have to do this or something else is going to happen to me.
Yes.
And
for
it's
sure.
like it puts that survival of the fittest in you. And I think most people that I speak to, specifically Owen Allred's granddaughter, she recognizes that Rena was a victim of Ervil and recognizes that while she pulled the trigger, it really is Ervil's.
It's Ervil. The persons responsible, the actual perpetrators responsible are Ervil and Dan Jordan, and they are in the grave. And I don't know if this is the right time to say this, but we've had deep conversations with Rena about all of that and what happened. And she's genuinely sorry for what she did. Like, she literally has said to me, I'm deeply sorry for the part that I played in that. And she would have never done it if it hadn't been for Ervil and for being forced and trying to not disobey and put your own life on the line. And she was
Right, 'cause when
brainwashed.
Right, when you're already on a trajectory where this guy's going to be taking people out and you don't obey him, who's to say he's not going to take you out?
And
Mhm.
so what I want to also say is, if anybody has a different lens through which they're viewing Rena, we want to honor
Sure.
Yeah.
and not
They don't
even
have to change
try.
their
They don't
minds.
have to change their minds about
No,
her
no. And I don't
at
think,
all.
yeah.
And that's not what we're asking at
No.
all.
But
Not
we-
from the
Maybe some of
victims.
maybe some of the later generations though can
Yeah. And
I
then
think there's this
and then
new-
the other thing is that with Rena, we've had the opportunity to know her current life and who she is today, but
Right.
because after certain events took place, she went radio silent as far as media interviews. There's not been any of her voice in the media in all of these years, decades now. And so the perspective that people have of her and her life is
changed.
very, very aged. There's also things that people think that a bit information available online that's very erroneous about her.
Yeah.
And so we would just like to correct those things if we can, and say that, that she's not a wealthy woman. She lives in a double wide trailer.
For the
and
past
has-
25 years.
It's a
People think
25-year-old one. And
People
she
think
is
that she's lived this great,
extravagant life.
extravagant life because of what she did, or she got money somehow from.
No. And
That's not even
so
sort of
she's in her mid-60s and
Still working.
works every day a manual labor job. So people can
she's
draw
not
their own
living in the lap of
conclusions.
luxury because of anything that she did.
And she is a different person today. There's an
Yes.
organization that she has volunteered for since 2007, where once a month she gives up Friday, Saturday, and Sunday to help people overcome life's hurts, hangups, and habits. And trauma, really.
Helps people that suffered traumas.
And that's not to say, that does not justify anything that happened. There's no justification for what happened. And even us saying these were all the things that we suffered and we were also victims does not justify the taking of a life.
no.
And so we're not asking your audience to feel like we're justifying anything, because there is no way to do that. With as far as, the criminal courts and the court system, the jail system, being incarcerated, all of those things are designed to deter crime. And what we want to say in loud and clear is it's been over 30 years now since any of us have been involved in the taking of any life. And 30 years is a long time to demonstrate repentance, remorse, and the ability to correct the life that you're living into a way that creates goodness in the world. And that's what we're about for the past 30 years.
Do you both hold like a level of guilt for what your father did? Because
I don't hold
A lot of
guilt.
shame, not guilt, but shame for sure. I wouldn't even take my dad's name. When I divorced in 2019 after being married for 17 years, I did not want my dad's name back because there's a lot of shame around that. I never wanted anyone to know I was associated with any of Ervil LeBaron or any of those things that happened. It wasn't until Anna got a contract for her book to be published that she came to me and was like, Celia, I'd really like to use your real name in the book if I can, but I understand that this is a privacy issue for you. So just think about it and let me know what you want me to change your name to.
yeah.
And I didn't have to think about it. I said, Anna, my kids are grown. They were all graduated from high school, from this community that I've always been very private in and not wanting people to know. and you can use my real name. And I dipped my toe in the
Well,
water.
it's very clear. I think at least like I'm so glad that this series gave you and your siblings the opportunity to share your side of the stories, because I think people that don't know a lot about the story have a very preconceived idea about the family, right?
Right.
But what I loved about Anna's book and this series is seeing really how disconnected the kids were from the greater picture and how hidden all of that was from your lives, and how you were learning in real time a lot of what everyone else was learning. What is that like when you have this one idea in your head of who your father is, and then you learn about who he really is? What does that do?
So can you ask that question again in just a minute? Because I want to answer your question about the guilt.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, because Celia
No.
answered, not you
And
did.
Celia answered, and I loved her answer.
Oh, and
But
I
also,
totally forgot that you didn't answer it. I'm so sorry.
so in addition, I think this is probably the most important thing that I want to say today
Okay.
is, even though we aren't the guilty parties, we can apologize on his behalf. And for some people, getting an apology and having the pain and grief and loss acknowledged, even by somebody like Ervil was my father, and I, with all my heart, want people to know that we are sorry.
We know it was wrong, like 100% wrong and evil.
And we're sorry for the pain and suffering and loss that our father caused.
Right.
And I'm willing to have this conversation with anyone who would like to hear it from me personally. If they want to talk about their pain and have it acknowledged by me, it would be an honor.
You have
For
such
me.
you guys have such beautiful hearts. I'm just touched by how
We want goodness in the world. And if we can be part of somebody's healing experience, and not everybody may want that or need that, or,
Right.
you know,
Oh, and it
but
may
if
not
there's
be right for them.
anybody, if there's anybody out there who that would be reparative for them, there's just not much that I'm not willing to do to help someone else heal from the pain and the trauma that was caused.
something that you spoke about in an interview I watched years ago was talking about recreating what the legacy is of the LeBaron name. And what do you see your legacy, the two of you and your siblings that are working towards, you know, sharing your stories? What do you want that legacy to look like?
Healing, growth, freedom, determination, and persistence and grit. You know, all
We
of
are
these
a group
things.
of overcomers.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah,
we had
resilience.
so many odds stacked against us. The way we were raised, that whole list Anna gave, that's what we were raised in. And yet here I am. I raised my kids differently.
Yeah.
I raised my kids to be educated. I raised them to be, truthful and kind. And that's been my message. And I think that all of our siblings are trying to get to the other side of that dark stigma that's hanging over them, trying to show their true good natures now that they've had a chance to actually be their own true selves instead of puppets for the cult.
And I don't just want goodness and all these things and resilience and grit and determination. You know, I don't want these things just to define our lives.
Yeah.
I want healing for everyone who suffered because of our father.
It's such a layered story. And I think that's really what fascinates so many people, is of all of the ways that all of this interconnects and interweaves, and how many families were impacted by what happened, and how many different groups were impacted by what happened, and how that reverberated through the groups after what happened.
Generationally.
Yeah.
We caused so much devastation and harm.
Yeah.
And I just think it can't be overstated that anyone who's wanting to exploit these stories for salacious, sensational reasons, they've overstayed their welcome. We want goodness and kindness for everyone to be the result of us speaking up the way we are.
We're wanting there to be more understanding.
Can you speak to that about, are there people that have been exploiting the story and
the media? the media is who we're talking about.
Okay.
You know, just the way they demonize Ervil's children to this day. And that's because we have been very quiet
Yeah.
Right.
and not saying what's the new. Like, one of the reasons we wanted to do the documentary is because of the narratives that are still out there. You know, one of Ervil's children could rise up, and that is like the furthest thing. Ervil LeBaron's children are the ones who want this violent, who wanted it to stop the most, and it did stop.
Some of them even risking their lives to
put an end to it.
bring an end to it.
And so 30 years, I believe, is now enough time for that to be demonstrated that this is a real thing and nobody needs to be afraid anymore. If we can dispel the fear, we've done our job.
You make such a good point, because there are tabloids that when they speak about your father, it's like polygamy Mason, you know, Charles Mason, and there's this.
But I get it. My dad, our dad deserves that.
Yeah,
like,
I mean, they did very similar things.
Yeah.
I think it's always unfair, though, to put it on the kids that weren't involved, right?
We did not choose our parents.
Yeah.
Now, some of them were involved and did things, and sentences in prison. So, but also the demonizing of the children that have for 30 years demonstrated repentance, remorse, and correction, and their lives transformed.
Acknowledge that finally.
Let's talk that. If that's not part of the conversation, then they're missing the main point. The real story here is the past 30 years of overcoming.
Right.
While all the things that happened in the 70s and 80s, that is happened, and it's how many years ago now? Over 30 years ago.
Well, and I feel like your dad's story has been in some ways overshadowed by some of the other atrocities that have occurred, you know, within the FLDS and some of these other groups, because it feels like there's always something happening. I mean, there's actually a LeBaron, one Wesley Ross.
Yes.
He's
Ross
like
Wesley.
He's on trial right now, or he's going.
Oh gosh.
Yeah. And
that's not part of our
No. It's, but I'm saying, like,
separate, but yes,
there's always, it seems, something happening in these communities that tends to, like, people don't have a long history or long memory, you know what I mean? And what I think is beautiful about this day and age is that I feel like the youth that are coming up today have a completely different understanding of and compassion to people that were victims and also perpetrators. I think a really good example of that would be Gypsy Rose Blanchard. Look at all of the support she has received, having come out and served her sentence for her mother's death, and yet she has 8 million people on her Instagram that are cheering her on.
I don't know what she's like today, but I watched the documentary about her and I'm like, her mom literally had her trapped. I don't think she saw another way out of that.
I'm good friends with her.
But also, let's not just bring all this
I don't know the whole
stuff back
story
into this conversation. We want to have this be a conversation where the focus is on the good stuff that can come out of these horrible, difficult circumstances.
I was only saying all of that to say that there's a generation of people that are empathetic to what you all went through. And understand that many of you were placed in an impossible situation.
With no choice.
Right. And I have never, ever viewed any of the children that were not involved in this as being under the umbrella of evil, of, you know, what happened, because you weren't there. You weren't a part of it. It wasn't your responsibility. I can understand having guilt, though, that guilt of
just more shame than anything else, I would say.
And I would say to that shame, anybody that has it, Brene Brown's book, Daring Greatly. I read that in 2013, the year before I started writing my book. And that book helped me drop the cloak of shame that I wore for being Ervil LeBaron's daughter. And now here we are 11 years after that.
Yeah.
And, you know, maybe 10 years after that we, you know, made the documentary, and then it just released. But it took about 10 years of processing through everything that I had just like suppress. Yeah. Because it was too much, you know, and it took another 10 years.
But there's that whole level of suppression too within that culture of like, you're not supposed to acknowledge your jealousies and your pain and your suffering, because suffering is an indication of the blessings that are going to be coming for you in heaven, which is so toxic, right? It just sets you up to accept abuse.
And so I'm going to quote Dr. Brene Brown again, because I love her work so much. She says, you cannot selectively numb your emotions. If you numb the negative ones, you're also numbing the positive ones. And so we grew up with this very narrow band of emotions that were allowed, and everything else had to be squashed. All the negative ones had to be squashed. So it squashed so much positive. And so there's people who think that we laugh too much or smile too much while we're talking about these really difficult things. But man, when you don't have to suppress the emotions anymore, and you get to process those in a healthy way, and then you get to experience what happiness feels like and joy, and have experiences that are good and that bring more goodness, yes, I'm going to smile about that.
Everyone, and I feel like everyone processes their grief and sometimes I'm accused of smiling while I'm talking about something that's very difficult, and I think we all have, I know for me, I'm a trauma survivor and I disassociate, and it's easier for me to smile when I'm talking about something difficult because then I disconnect from that pain. And I can imagine when you're disconnected from your feelings, when you grow up in that kind of culture, being able to feel anything is like amazing.
I had somebody comment today who's a therapist to me about a post that I made that was a little bit silly. And she goes, did you know being able to tap into your sense of humor alongside sharing really hard things is actually a sign of emotional flexibility and resilience? And you, my friend, are a beautiful picture of both.
I love that. So this has been a super long interview, but I want to just sort of wrap things up with some, I guess, parting thoughts about what you hope for. You've touched on quite a bit of what you would want and what your legacy would be, but what are your hopes out of all of this, that whether it be forgiveness, whether it be that you can be seen outside of the evil layer of who your father was?
I mean, for
Our
me,
hope is for healing, for all sides.
The way I would say it is, regardless of your family of origin, even if it's extremely toxic the way ours was, you after you become a grown adult and you can think for yourself and you're 25 years old and all your prefrontal cortex is working just right, you get to define your life. You get to decide what you want your legacy to be. And I hope that everyone, regardless of which side you were on, will find the way to seek healing, whether that's just talking with a friend, a mentor, a spiritual person, or a therapist. Talking about things are what has brought us the most healing. And so I would wish that healing, a process that I'm still in, I haven't arrived. I would wish for everyone to have the resources and the capacity to seek that out and pursue it, for their own good and for their own benefit, and for that of their children, if they have any, and their grandchildren and future. Because while, quote, the sins of the father are passed to the third and fourth generation, I believe that, when you exude goodness, that is also passed down to 1,000 generations.
Oh, yes.
That's my message, is let's be about goodness and passing that legacy on to others.
And I would say, carrying that just a step further, is don't allow the toxicity you were raised in to define your life. Find your own power and create goodness for yourself and for your next generation.
I think she was going to say, even though they controlled so much about your life, at a young age, they don't get to be the ones who decide what your life is going to be once you are a grown adult, mature, and able to make the choices that you are able to make.
My final question for you is that I have a lot of people that watch that are still entrenched in these groups, and maybe many are doubting. I speak to women every day that feel like they are trapped in impossible situations, that are starting to wake up to this idea that I have been misled. This is not the life I want for my children, but they're afraid to leave. Do you have any encouragement that you could offer to those ladies that have been walking in the path of this righteous polygamous lifestyle?
I mean, leaving is a hard thing to do, but staying is hard too.
I'm so glad I got out. That's all I can say. So thankful that I
I'm
was
glad
able to
I'm glad I got out.
find
And
my power.
it took a lot of years to create the life that I have now, that I do feel proud of, and that's good. And it will be a lot of hard work and determination and persistence in order to create the life that you're imagining for yourself and that you were created to live. Each of us was born good, born with gifts and talents and goodness to offer the world, whether it's art or music or, engineering or midwifery, whatever it is. Each of us has gifts to offer the world to make this world a better place. You can do that when you have the freedom of thought to create the life that you want. And
I just say, think of your children and how do you want them to grow up?
And what would you like? Sometimes the advice that's given is, if somebody was coming to you, like your child was coming to you with this problem, what would your advice be to them? Or your best friend was coming to you for advice about your circumstances.
Somebody that you really, really love.
Yeah.
Get in that mindset of putting yourself in, what advice would I give to them? I love that.
Yeah, follow that. And we all have that internal guidance system that, when you're in those circumstances, you have to doubt that and deny it and quiet that inner voice that tells you what's right and wrong and good. And you can start listening to that inner voice, and nobody has to know.
That inner voice in you that says this isn't right is right.
Is correct.
That inner voice, that gut feeling. The best thing I ever learned, I'm a big proponent of therapy as well. The best thing I ever learned in therapy is that if your body is telling you that something is a red flag, to listen to that.
Yes.
And anyone that tells you to ignore it, to not listen to them.
Correct. There's a reason why they're telling you to ignore it, and they're benefiting in some way by you ignoring it.
Well, you ladies are phenomenal. So much strength, so much courage. I know, and I hope that as you continue on this path, that you are able to reach many people. And I think most people can see at least what I'm seeing in you, and that is two beautiful souls that have overcome so much. And you are such a testament and so brave to speak out. Thank you so much for doing this. You are such an inspiration to so many women. You have no idea.
Thank you. I hope so. I hope that we're a positive voice.
I could just cry right now.
Oh, thank you for having us.